Hello and welcome. In this first lesson, I want to answer the question, what is SwiftUI? But I also want to make sure that you're very clear on how SwiftUI compares with UIKit, which is how we used to do things and how we used to build user interfaces before SwiftUI. I'm also going to go over the advantages of SwiftUI and also its current limitations. Don't worry though, this video isn't going to be all talk. I'll show you practical examples and we'll also get into Xcode 11 and I'll walk you through how to build a demo SwiftUI project so you can get your feet wet. All right, let's get started. Hi, my name is Chris, and if this is the first time you're here, welcome to Code with Chris, where we teach beginners how to make apps. Now, before we dive in, I have a quick question for you. When do you find time for learning new things? This is especially relevant for me right now because I'm spending a lot of time learning SwiftUI, and personally, for me, I find mornings to be best. So let me know how you learn best when you find time to do that in the comment section below. And if you wouldn't mind, on your way down there, please give this video a quick like. I really appreciate it. It really helps with the YouTube algorithm and getting more eyeballs on this video. So I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. All right, with that said, let's talk SwiftUI. To understand SwiftUI and fully appreciate how much easier it makes building user interfaces, let's compare it to how we used to build user interfaces with UIKit. Using UIKit, we're able to use code to build the UI programmatically, but we have to be very literal and precise about exactly what happens. For example, let's say we wanted to put a text label in the center of the screen. Here's how that would look if we did it programmatically with UIKit. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a label element to add to the view. So let's add a comment here. And I'm going to declare a new constant. We'll just call it label. And we're going to create a new UI label element and assign it to this constant. Next, we are going to set the text to hello. And then we're also going to set this property called translates auto-resizing mask into constraints to false. And if you're not sure what the auto-resizing mask is, it's something from an old layout system before auto layout that worked on something called struts and springs, where you describe which sides or edges the element should hug and how it should compact and expand depending on how much space there was. And when auto layout was introduced, then we were able to specify the rules, which we call constraints, on how to size and position things. And so what it would do, it would try to change that auto-resizing mask and translate it into auto layout constraints. If we don't set this to false, it's going to try to create by default these constraints for us, which will interfere with the exact positioning and sizing that we want to achieve. So we have to remember to set this to false. Okay, so what we also have to do is remember to add this label to the actual view, because if we don't, the label is actually not visible and it's not in the view hierarchy. So we're going to say view.add subview and we're going to add the label, and now the label is on the view, and there is no positioning for it yet, so it might not even be visible. So here we got to create some constraints, which is going to describe how to position this label inside of that view. So we're going to center it on the screen. I'm going to create two constraints. I'm going to just create this first one, and I'm going to assign it to a constant called center x. All right, so when you're specifying a constraint, you're basically relating two things together. So we're going to relate our label to the view, and we're going to make them both have equal center x's. And that is basically centering it horizontally. Right? So we want the label to be in the middle of the view. So the first item is label. The attribute that we want to define this constraint for is the center x, and that's basically the center point of the element. We're going to relate it by equal, and to which item? We're going to relate the label to the root view, remember? So we're going to specify the view, and we are going to relate it to the center x attribute of that view. Multiplier is 1 and constant is 0. And the multiplier and constant just lets us, they're exactly what they mean, to specify either a slight offset with the constant or a multiple with the multiplier right there. Okay, so now we got to do the same thing, but for the y-axis, and this is going to center it vertically. rather than just typing all of that out again, I'm just going to copy and paste this guy and just change center X to center Y. So now we're relating, oops, moving too fast there. Now we're still relating the label, right, to the view, except we're making both of them have the same center Y. And then lastly, don't forget to add these two constraints to the view. And this is one distinction that also a lot of beginners have trouble with, is that, let me just finish this before I explain it. So I'm going to add the center X and center Y constraints to the view. Now, the thing that confuses beginners sometimes is that in order to position the label, you actually have to add the constraints to its parent container, which is the view, because the label is inside of the view, right? However, if you're specifying sizing constraints for the label, then you're going to be adding those constraints to the actual element. So you would add it to the label. Positioning ones go in the parent container, whereas sizing ones go on the actual element. So that's one distinction that you have to do. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So let me just run this and you can take a look at what we get. So we did all of that typing just to put a hello label in the center of the screen. And the other thing is that the order of your code statements here actually matter. Because for example, in this line of code, we added the label into the view. But if we took this line out, let's say we forgot to add it all together, this would crash because you're trying to relate two items, like the view and the label, where one of the elements is actually not in the view, so you're not able to draw that relationship, right? Also, if you had remembered to add the label to the view, but you added it down here, again, it would crash because this line of code, right, is actually applying the constraints, and the constraints is looking for the label, but the label isn't in the view. So you actually have to make sure that the label is in the view up here before you try to, add any sort of positioning constraints for that element. So these are all things that can actually go wrong. So that's programmatic UI in UIKit. But that's not the only way you can build user interfaces with UIKit. You can also use Interface Builder in Storyboards, and here's how that would look like. So to achieve the label in the center of the screen using Storyboards, what we're going to first do is open up the object library up here, and then we're going to search for label. And then we're going to drag it and drop it into our view right there. So we've got our label on the screen. However, it's not positioned at all. We have to add some constraints to it. So make sure that you have your label highlighted and then open up this Add Constraints menu. And actually, we want this Alignment Constraints menu beside it instead. You're going to want to check off horizontally and vertically in container and then say add these two constraints. And just like that, we've got the label in the center of the screen. The last thing to do is to change its text. So highlight the label here in the document outline, and then let's type hello, and let's run our app. And then we're going to see it in the simulator with the label in the center of the screen. Now that might have seemed easier and faster versus programmatic UI, but using Storyboards brings about its own set of challenges. I have an entire video comparing the programmatic UI approach with the Storyboards approach right there. However, whether you're using Storyboards or not, using UIKit requires you to be very explicit and precise about exactly what you want the layout system to do. This is known as building your UI imperatively. This is very different from SwiftUI, which is a declarative framework. Now let's take a look at what that means. With SwiftUI, you don't have to specify every single little detail because the system handles a lot of that grunt work for you. You simply have to describe to the layout system what you want and it'll go and do that for you. In the WWDC video describing and introducing SwiftUI, they used a great analogy that I still use today to describe the difference between SwiftUI and UIKit. UIKit is like you talking to a friend through the phone and giving him very precise and explicit instructions about how to make an avocado toast properly. Whereas SwiftUI is like you telling an avocado toast expert what you would like and then just having the expert go and do it for you. With SwiftUI, you don't need to worry about every single little detail, such as whether or not the button is added to the view. Let's use our previous example about putting the label in the center of the screen, and let's see how much easier it is to do with SwiftUI. Now here what I've got is a default, just out-of-the-box SwiftUI project. And what we want to do is put a label on the center of the screen. However, the default project that you start with is already a label in the center of the screen. So before we dive into how we create that, let me just give you a quick walkthrough of how you create user interfaces inside SwiftUI. Basically, you're writing code on the left-hand side here, and on the right-hand side, you get a preview. Now you can also launch it in the simulator to see what your UI looks like, but this preview is pretty handy. So let's dive into the code here. This text element is all you need to write in order to have this label in the center of the screen. And just to make it the same as all of our other demos, we're just going to have hello. So there you see it. If I run the project, you're going to see that we get the same thing with our previous two demos, using Storyboards with UIKit and also Programmatic UI with UIKit. See? Now notice that I didn't have to add any constraints. I didn't have to tell the system to put the text in the middle of the screen. All I indicated here was that I wanted a label that said hello. And the layout system automatically made some assumptions of where I wanted to position it. I could manually add some rules or specify where I wanted to position it. Maybe I want to add a margin here or that side, some padding, or I wanted to push it all the way to the top of the screen. But because I didn't specify any of that stuff, it made an assumption that I wanted it in the center of the screen, which is logical to me. And that's what it did. You see what a difference that is compared to UIKit? So which is better and why would we want to use SwiftUI? Well, let's just get one thing straight right off the bat. Apple says SwiftUI is the future of iOS app development, and that's that. You either get on the train or you don't. Same thing happened with Objective-C and Swift. Now you might argue that Objective-C can still be used today, but you have to agree with me when I say the large majority of people have either started with Swift or they converted to Swift and they love it. And I predict the same thing is going to happen with SwiftUI and UIKit, even though it might take a couple of years. Luckily for us and for future iOS developers, SwiftUI does seem like the way to go, and I'm excited to go all in. However, there are a couple of things that are preventing me from doing that right now though. Number one, SwiftUI apps can only be run on iOS 13 and above. Now that is kind of a problem now because not everybody is on iOS 13. However, as time goes on and they release iOS 14, 15, 16, everyone's going to be upgrading and this is going to be a non-issue. Another problem that is going to be solved by time as well is that right now SwiftUI doesn't come with as many out-of-the-box controls as we're used to with UIKit. A lot of the major and useful and common ones are there right now, but there are also a lot of third-party controls and libraries for UIKit that right now just aren't available in SwiftUI. This makes it hard to go all in 100% SwiftUI, but luckily we don't have to because you can actually use UIKit controls on top of a SwiftUI app. So I think for now, that's the way to go. SwiftUI is still in its infancy. It's going to take a few years for it to mature, but there's no time like the present to get a head start and start learning it now. Now let's dive into Xcode 11 and see how you can start building a SwiftUI app. All right, now let's start a brand new Xcode 11 project so I can walk you through how to start a new SwiftUI project as well as some of the different parts of the Xcode user interface that has to do with working in SwiftUI. All right, so let's go ahead and create a new Xcode project. We're going to choose a single view application, and what's going to matter is what you select down here for user interface. Make sure it's set to SwiftUI if that's what you want to work with, or set to Storyboard if you want to work with UIKit. All right, so let's indicate that this is just a test. I'm just going to call this SwiftUI test. You can put anything for these other properties. Make sure that the language is set to Swift. Leave these unchecked and go ahead, click next, and let's just save it. So it's going to create that project there. And before we dive into this content view.swift, let's take a look at what we have on the left-hand side. Now, if you're coming from working with UIKit and Storyboards and stuff like that, in Xcode 10 or 9, then you will notice that instead of just an app delegate, we also have a scene delegate now. Essentially, the responsibilities that the app delegate was taking care of has been split into both an app delegate and a scene delegate. And the reason for that is because with iOS 13 and now the iPad's getting bigger, there is multiple window support. And that means that potentially your app could be running multiple instances of itself simultaneously. So the app delegate is still in charge of the overall app lifecycle. However, the scene delegate handles all of these different windows, potentially, 2 different windows housing your app simultaneously. Next up, you'll notice that we have much of the same elements, the other files. You have the asset library, you have the launch screen, you have the info plist, but we don't have a view controller anymore. What we have is a content view, and this file is basically where you're going to specify your user interface for a single screen in your app. So let's take a look at the code inside of this content view. You can see that you kind of have 2 different structs here, right? And then on the right hand side, you should see this preview pane. If you don't, let me just first go through how you hide and show this preview pane, because it's actually very useful. So you might have something that looks like this, where it's just the code editor, but if you click this editor options button here, you're going to see that you can select canvas. So this is your preview canvas. It actually gives you a preview of what your user interface looks like on this side. So if you click resume, what it's going to do behind the scenes is it's going to launch a simulator, it's going to compile that code that you have, and it's going to show you what that preview is. Now, what's really cool is that you can change this preview to show you what you need. By default, you get this device frame here and you get your UI here, but what's actually happening is this block of code here called content view previews. This code is what is generating the preview here on the right hand side. It's just for development and debugging purposes. This code that I have highlighted here doesn't affect your production app. It doesn't affect the functionality of your app. It's just for generating previews here on the right hand side. If you wanted to see 2 of these guys, you could create another instance of the content view and put it in a vertical stack or something like that, so you can have one on top of each other, or you can change the device frame. Maybe you want to see it in an iPhone 6 for some reason, or you want to see it in landscape orientation. You can add all sorts of modifiers, or maybe you want to zoom in and you only want to look at a specific element on your screen. You could do that as well. So this chunk of code right here is to modify your preview on the right hand side. This struct here, this is your actual user interface code. And you can see here that this class is called, or struct is called content view, and it returns a view. And then you have a body property that returns some view. Now some view just means that it could be any type of view, because it doesn't know what your root view is going to be, but at the end of the day, it's still going to be a subclass of view. And then in here you have your various user interface elements. Now right here we only have a text label, but what you can actually do is open up the object library, and you can, as long as you're in this tab right here, because there's a couple of different ones, as long as you're in this one, you can actually drag the different elements as code into here. Now we're going to get into different elements and different layout containers in the next lesson. So for now, we're not going to dive too deeply into these different elements, because I just want to give you an overall feel of how the user interface looks like for Xcode 11 and SwiftUI. Now you can see here that as soon as I change something, it said that the automatic preview updating is paused. So it's not reflecting automatically what I type here, right? When maybe I make a change there, if it's not updating here on the right hand side, all you need to do is click resume, and that's going to recompile the code, and then you're going to get an updated preview on the right hand side. The other thing you can do is also preview on your device. That's what this button down here is for. Or you can do something called a live preview. If you click that, this is going to be constantly monitoring the changes that you make on this side, so that when you make a change here, it slows down a little bit, but it detects the changes and it shows you the live changes here on the preview pane without you having to go hit resume all the time. So you can see here it takes a while for it to happen, so you might not want to have that on all the time, especially if you're into a long session of coding before you actually want to generate another preview or update the preview. Now there are some other interesting things you can do here on the right hand side of the screen. So you can actually modify things from this side. It's not just editing the code on the left hand side. For example, if I hold down Command and I click this, let's just get out of live preview for a second, stop that. If I hold down Command and I click this guy, you can see that I can do different things with it. And we'll get into what these different elements are, but I just want you to know that you can interact with the preview pane in order to modify the code on this side. So that's pretty cool. You can still build your UI visually, at least a bit of it. And then these modifiers here. See, I've selected that text element, and I can change font, I can change alignment, and I can change padding. And when I change these things in this sort of visual way, it actually changes the code, right? So you have an option of how you want to edit and build your UI. So, you know, I can specify numbers here, and you can see here it's changing the code. Now, if you're very well versed with the SwiftUI code and syntax and you've been working with it a long time, obviously it's going to be a lot faster for you just to type it all out. But you know, it's really cool to be able to do it visually as well, so that you can see how it affects the code. And like you saw before, you can actually drag these elements straight into the code like this. So I think it's really, really awesome. So I hope that gave you a good feel for Xcode 11, working on a SwiftUI project, and where all of the different things are. If you have time, I'd highly recommend you to fire up Xcode 11 yourself, start a brand new SwiftUI project just like we've done here, and just fiddle around. In the next lesson, I'm going to introduce you to a few more SwiftUI elements so we can start building some cool layouts. If you don't want to miss the next video, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, and don't forget to click that bell notification icon so you're going to get notified when the next lesson drops. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next lesson.